The next and the last of our keynote presentations, I'm delighted to say, is by Matt Hatton, who is a director of Machina Research, and he's going to be describing the impact of regulation on M2M. Please give a warm welcome to Matt Hatton.
Morning, everybody. As Jeremy said, my name is Matt Hatton. I'm a director at Machina Research. There's a few familiar faces in the audience, or certainly at the event earlier. But if you don't know who we are, we're a research consulting firm looking at M2M IoT. In fact, all aspects of M2M and IoT, vertical sectors, automotive, healthcare, utilities, as well as the more horizontal view in terms of technical commercial best practice. What I'm going to talk about today is the impact of regulation on the growth of M2M and IoT. And actually, I was talking to somebody about this before coming here today, and they said, well, is that not quite a boring subject? Regulation typically is not seen as being one of the more exciting areas of telecoms. But actually, the reality is when it comes to some of these new emerging technologies, new emerging business models, the impact of regulation can be quite significant. There can be very much a binary state in terms of what might be possible to do or what technologies it might be possible to use in terms of deploying these services. So for instance, if it's not possible to use cellular communications, people will use other forms of telecommunications. If there are privacy issues, then there are challenges potentially with deploying services at all. And so regulation gets to regulation is quite a critical part of what we might expect to be some of the influences of technological choice, of adoption and deployment of different M2M and IoT services. So that's my lesson. We have a few theories about regulation with regard to M2M and IoT. First off, it's difficult for regulation to keep pace with technology developments. I don't think there's anybody who will disagree very much with that. It's always been the case. Regulation has always been playing catch-up. So no big changes, no big surprises there. But increasingly, we're expecting regulators to be swamped with some of the changes that are implicit in M2M and IoT because there are so many. Okay? It's such a fundamental shift from what regulators were used to regulating over to M2M and IoT. So historically, it was about 2 or 3 different types of devices doing 2 or 3 different things. So a phone making telephone calls, a PC accessing the internet. And that was more or less it. Okay? There's some more sophistication in a few specialist niche areas. When it comes to M2M, you have dozens, hundreds, thousands of different applications and services that could be implemented, and many, many different ways in which each of those could be put in place using different technologies, different services, and so on. So the rules that were applicable to the old telecommunications services is not necessarily also applicable to M2M and IoT. And the biggest challenge that we think that the telecom sector, at least our bit of the telecom sector is facing, is this quicksand of regulatory uncertainty that we're talking about. And what I mean by quicksand is, it's likely that companies will be slower to implement M2M because of the uncertainty about what the regulation is. Not necessarily the regulation is bad or good, but more that there is a lack of certainty about what that regulation is. And that often causes an additional cost. So if you want to ensure that you are insulated against regulatory changes, sometimes it's necessary to put in place a solution which might be more expensive, but at least covers you for future-proofing against regulatory changes. So that's some of the background. We've been doing a set of regulatory research in the last 6 months or so, and it's ongoing. So we're talking to regulators around the world. We're supplementing that with secondary research to look at some of the interesting areas, particular specific areas that we think are going to be the key ones that might influence the growth of the market. So those are permanent roaming. So we see, obviously, M2M is very much an international set of services, or in many cases an international set of services. There are some more local, but a lot of them are very international. The automotive sector, consumer electronics, for instance. And supporting those connections, typically mobile network operators will want to use a roaming SIM, but there are variations in the regulation around whether it's permissible to use a roaming SIM in a market on an ongoing basis, on the basis of something other than just a roaming SIM. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. National roaming. So there are some benefits to being able to connect to all networks within a country in terms of supporting a connected device. So you might have devices that are tucked away in basements or devices that move around an awful lot. And having access to all networks is useful, and therefore national roaming is useful. Spectrum licensing. So there are arguments about whether there's a requirement for additional spectrum to be released specifically for machine-to-machine and the Internet of Things. Data sovereignty. So can you move data across borders? And there are diverse other regulations. There's things to do with numbering, things to do with taxation. So what I wanted to give you an idea of here is just some of those regulatory issues that we look at that we think might have some impact. And then I want to delve into a few. So numbering. It's been quite a popular thing amongst regulators to put in place a dedicated number scheme for machine-to-machine. So we have been surveying, as I mentioned, a lot of regulators, and what I'm presenting in the chart on the right-hand side is the results of those questions. So have you put in place a dedicated scheme for M2M? The majority have not, but a decent proportion of regulators have put in place a scheme. Now, the CEPT in Europe has encouraged the adoption, and half of the 18 CEPT members that we surveyed had implemented a scheme. Here in Germany, the decision was not necessary. Having spoken, the regulator spoke to the operators said, don't really see any particular value, and the decision was made to leave it at the moment. And we think that's the sensible move. To be honest, we can't really see any great significant benefit associated with it. And even where it is implemented, there's a wide variation in size. So when we surveyed the regulators, we asked them, how many numbers are you putting aside for M2M? And it varied between about 10 million and about 1 trillion. And those are two countries with more or less same sort of populations. Now, somebody's got it right, and somebody's got it wrong. Now, I don't know which one of them it is that's got it right and which one of them it is that's got it wrong, but in one country they're assuming 2 M2M connections per head of population, and in the other country they're assuming 200,000 M2M connections per head of population. So, challenge there associated with, if you do it, how many numbers is it worth putting in place? And also, what's the value of identifying an M2M device? The only reason why you'd want to identify an M2M device by giving it an M2M number is to treat it in some way differently. But if you're going to treat it in some way differently from handsets and tablets and so on, surely there is an arbitrage opportunity for somebody to say, well, my device is an M2M device rather than being another kind of device that's regulated in a different way. So we think that there's some significant challenges associated with this. Permanent roaming. So this is probably the trickiest issue that the regulatory world is facing with regard to M2M. Clearly, supporting connections overseas is a critical thing. And we've got actually the situation today where lots of mobile operators are supporting multiple connections in various territories using permanently roaming SIMs. And we asked the regulators about what the ruling was, what the regulation was in their country about permanent roaming. And for the vast majority, there was no clear rule. 74% said there's no regulation, but it's probably okay. There were a small number said there's no regulation, but it's probably prohibited. There was only one or a very few, Brazil included, that's the one that's normally frequently named, where they said it's absolutely prohibited. Okay, you can't have a permanently roaming SIM. However, we are aware that there are a number of companies that have roaming SIMs within Brazil and nothing has been done to them. So although it might be prohibited by the regulation, effectively nothing has been done to ban it in practice. So the problem here is one of uncertainty. It is not clear whether a SIM from one operator will legally be allowed to operate in a country in which that operator is not licensed. So that causes challenges for anybody who wants to implement a cellular-based solution worldwide. There's also a particular EU skew to this challenge. The EU should be about free movement of goods and services and so on. And so the assumption is that permanent roaming between territories within the EU should be absolutely fine. But speaking to some regulators, they say, actually, they're even looking at this quite closely. For a couple of reasons. One being that wholesale data caps, well, actually, a lot of it comes from this question of wholesale data caps. So in 1st of July 2014, the rate which the wholesale data cap was set at was reduced to 5 euro cents per megabyte. Okay. It would previously been 15 euro cents per megabyte. Now, at 5 euro cents per megabyte, it starts becoming quite competitive with what the standard prices are for M2M tariffs, right? And then you have a situation where any SIM roaming in any European market is able to demand more or less comparable pricing to a domestic SIM. That leaves you with the situation where there's potential for arbitrage opportunities, there's potential for upsetting the regulatory environment with people using exhausting number ranges. And this is something that the regulators are very aware of, and they have to start taking some action. Now, the fear is that action will be banning permanent roaming, which is against a lot of the EU principles. It would be detrimental to the growth of the M2M market, but you can see that could be a natural knee-jerk reaction. The other would be to distinguish M2M devices, but again, you have the same problem that we noted with numbering, where it's difficult to identify those that are M2M devices versus those that aren't. Maybe you can find some other sliding scale for data. The point is, there is this challenge associated with permanent roaming that regulators have to address, and there is an uncertainty around it, and they will need to start doing something to address it. Data management, to move on to a third area. These are taken very, very seriously by governments and regulators. So this is to do with privacy, it's to do with whether data can be sent across borders, and there's a lot of regulation that's coming through at the moment. And the question of data sovereignty is a particularly critical one. Are you allowed to send data across borders between countries? Because this will have implications for global deployments of services. The distinctions are quite important here in terms of what is payload versus what is content, what's private data versus what's machine data. Typically, we would expect that the regulation around what it's okay to send across borders will focus on content, i.e. anything that might be specific to a person or process, rather than just the mechanics of connecting and managing devices. And we would also expect it to be focused on private individuals. However, there's a gray area between these. It's not a binary state. So if we look, for instance, at the general data protection regulation that the EU is implementing, they have said that there are particular rules relating to anything related to a natural person. Okay? Now, that sounds like it's limited to personal data from maybe your communications devices, consumer electronics, and so forth. But it's actually a wider thing. So you take something like a fleet management application. If a fleet management application is tied to a person, then that is, strictly speaking, data that can be identified as being related to an individual. So there's some challenges associated with this issue of data management. Spectrum. So historically, the requirements for spectrum for typical connected devices was just give me more and let me connect my customers. With regard to M2M, there's actually much more diverse requirement for spectrum, much more diverse set of technologies that are being used, and so there is a greater impetus being put on regulators to make spectrum available, particularly unlicensed spectrum. For instance, we've had just recently had a couple of reallocations around about 900 megahertz that have come through to make available more unlicensed spectrum. And this use of unlicensed spectrum is quite a common thing within M2M. We've seen the arrival of a number of low-power wide area network companies, Sigfox, for instance, that are making use of this unlicensed spectrum. And there have to be put in place some very strict rules about how that spectrum can be used in terms of power output and duty cycle and these sorts of things. And that might be putting some artificial restrictions on how rapidly M2M can develop. If you think that M2M is about connecting a particular device for a particular purpose, but as we move towards IoT, IoT is about potentially an infinity of different possibilities, lots of different ways in which you might connect devices for lots of different reasons. And putting in place very strict rules on how you can use spectrum and in what ways actually causes some challenges as we might seek to evolve services. If you need more bandwidth, more connections, more activity on that device, then the restrictions on the use of that spectrum might cause some challenges. And we have the typical problems with harmonization of spectrum bands for the likes of LTE and so forth. So to conclude, regulation related to M2M is unclear and changing, which is not a healthy combination when you come to implement. It generates what we term a risk premium. So you have to assume some additional cost in order to future-proof, which might limit product innovation and might slow down service deployment. Now, don't get me wrong, we're seeing very, very rapid service deployment, very rapid rates of innovation, and it's wonderful to see all of that. But there is a danger that regulation could limit it. And there's a further challenge around vertical specific regulations. I haven't talked about those at all, but those will also have an implication for M2M. So the message that we get from this research that we do and the message that we will generally project out to regulators, and I was speaking at a regulatory event only last week in Vienna, week before, the message we put out is that the industry needs clarity above all things. So with that, thank you very much. I'll hand back to Jeremy.